Naomi Brooks had always believed that work done with care carried its own dignity. At 56, she moved with a quiet rhythm born from decades of labor, her hands skilled, her back straight, and her spirit unbroken. Years of scrubbing, polishing, and tending had not hardened her. Instead, they had given her a kind of patience that only those who have endured can carry. She was a housekeeper by trade, but anyone who watched her carefully would see she treated every task as an act of respect. Not for her employers, but for herself. The Whitmore estate was her latest posting, a mansion steeped in marble and crystal chandeliers, where wealth gleamed in every corner. It was the kind of home meant to project power, but beneath the polish, bitterness lingered. Naomi had not been there long before she met its true mistress, Evelyn Whitmore. Evelyn was a woman in her early 40s, dressed always in designer silks, her hair a carefully coiffed crown. She had grown up with wealth and had married into even more, believing it gave her license to measure others by her own shallow standards. From the moment Naomi arrived, Evelyn treated her as if she were invisible when convenient and disposable when not. Commands were sharp, often humiliating, laced with reminders that Naomi was lucky to be working there. Evelyn's voice was a blade, polished, but cutting deep. Jonathan Whitmore, Evelyn's husband, was the opposite in manner, though just as bound by silence. A financier with weary eyes, he watched the exchanges between his wife and Naomi with a quiet discomfort. Jonathan was a man long accustomed to Evelyn's temper, yet something about Naomi unsettled him, not in a threatening way, but in the way truth unsettles a guilty conscience. He noticed the grace with which Naomi endured Evelyn's barbs, how she never stooped to anger, never abandoned her dignity. Her silence was not submission, it was strength. For Naomi, this was not new. She had seen women like Evelyn before, brittle, insecure, cloaked in superiority to hide their wounds. Naomi did not despise her. She pitied her. Still, Evelyn's cruelty cut deep. The most painful moments were not in the shouted orders but in the subtle humiliations, the way Evelyn would introduce her to guests as the help, the mocking way she imitated Naomi's careful, deliberate speech. These were wounds intended to belittle, to shrink her presence in the grand house. But Naomi could not be shrunk. Each day, she carried herself with the same quiet composure, her eyes holding a wisdom Evelyn could neither understand nor destroy. And though Evelyn laughed, though she sneered and sought to diminish her, Naomi's presence began to create a shift, small, imperceptible cracks in the Whitmore household. Jonathan lingered longer in rooms where Naomi worked, watching how her steadiness filled the silence Evelyn so often poisoned. He began to feel the weight of contrast, the harshness of his wife and the quiet resilience of the housekeeper. He did not say it aloud, but he was beginning to admire Naomi's dignity. And that, unknowingly, was the seed of the conflict to come. The Whitmore estate glittered with chandeliers and polished marble, but no amount of shine could mask the tension that settled into its walls. As weeks passed, Evelyn Whitmore's contempt for Naomi Brooks did not soften. It sharpened. What had begun as casual dismissiveness grew into something almost obsessive. Evelyn seemed determined to remind Naomi of her place at every opportunity. Yet the more she tried to belittle her, the less it worked. Naomi never raised her voice. She never retaliated with anger. She simply met cruelty with quiet steadiness, her eyes calm, her words measured. That composure became Evelyn's torment. Evelyn wanted her insults to sting, to draw blood, but Naomi would not give her that satisfaction. And so Evelyn pushed harder, barking orders in front of dinner guests, assigning Naomi pointless tasks, criticizing her clothes, even mocking her accent when she thought Jonathan wasn't listening. But Jonathan was listening. More than that, he was watching. The more Evelyn exposed her own bitterness, the more Jonathan noticed Naomi's dignity. When Evelyn spat venom, Naomi responded with grace. When Evelyn tried to humiliate, Naomi carried herself with poise. In those quiet moments, Jonathan began to feel something unexpected. Not attraction in the shallow sense, but a profound respect for Naomi's strength. It was the kind of respect he had long stopped feeling for his wife. Evelyn noticed the shift before Jonathan did. She caught the way his eyes lingered on Naomi, not with desire, but with acknowledgement. That look, the look of admiration, was something Evelyn herself had not seen from her husband in years, and it cut her deeper than she would admit. Insecurity began to gnaw at her, and like a cornered animal, she lashed out. She began inventing stories, telling friends over wine that Naomi was clumsy, that she had broken crystal glasses or mishandled the silver. None of it was true, but Evelyn spoke it with conviction, hoping to paint Naomi as incompetent. Yet the household staff knew better. They had seen Naomi's precision, her care with every detail. Whispered conversations among the cooks and gardeners began to turn against Evelyn. Behind closed doors, the Whitmores' reputation was shifting, not because of Naomi's words, but because of Evelyn's cruelty. Naomi, however, never fed the gossip. She did her work with the same steady devotion as before, not out of submission but out of a quiet understanding. Evelyn's cruelty was not power. It was weakness wearing a mask. Naomi had seen too much of life to mistake bitterness for strength. Jonathan, meanwhile, wrestled with guilt. He had allowed Evelyn's cruelty to go unchecked for years, excusing it as temperament. But now, watching Naomi endure with dignity, he began to realize that silence was complicity. Every unchallenged insult, every ignored slight, they were stains on his conscience. And as Evelyn's insecurities deepened, Jonathan found himself caught between two women, one who demanded power through humiliation, and another who embodied it through grace. The estate was becoming a stage where Evelyn's pride and Naomi's dignity clashed. And though Evelyn held the title of mistress, it was Naomi's quiet strength that filled the house with a different kind of authority. One Evelyn could not control, and Jonathan could not ignore. The Whitmore mansion had many rooms, but there was one Naomi noticed was always locked: the nursery. Dust lingered on its heavy wooden door, and no staff were ever assigned to clean it. At first, she thought little of it. In houses this large, unused rooms were common. Yet the way Evelyn flinched whenever she passed that door told another story. One rainy afternoon, Naomi was dusting the hallway when Evelyn appeared suddenly, carrying a glass of wine though it was barely noon. She saw Naomi glance at the nursery and snapped, "That room is off limits. Do your job elsewhere." Her voice cracked as she said it, the kind of crack that comes not from anger but from pain. Naomi said nothing, simply nodded, but she filed the moment away in her heart. Days later, Jonathan found Naomi in the kitchen preparing tea. His voice was low, tired, and waited. "You've seen the nursery, haven't you?" Naomi nodded, but carefully. She knew this was dangerous ground. Jonathan poured himself a drink and sat at the counter, his eyes distant. Then, quietly, he began to speak. Years ago, Evelyn had given birth to a daughter. The child, Lily, had been fragile, born with a heart defect. She had survived only a few months before passing in her sleep. Naomi listened as Jonathan described the night they lost her, the silence that fell over the house, and the way Evelyn had never recovered. Instead of grieving openly, Evelyn buried her pain beneath layers of control, hostility, and arrogance. The nursery had been locked ever since, frozen in time as a shrine to both love and loss. Naomi's chest ached with recognition. She understood grief. She had buried her own child once, a son lost in his teens to illness. She knew the way sorrow twisted itself into anger, how pain could harden into cruelty if left unchecked. For the first time, Evelyn's insults began to make sense. They weren't born from superiority, but from a wound so deep it had poisoned her spirit. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice breaking. "I stayed silent because I thought I was protecting her, but all I did was let her bitterness grow. And I let her treat you and others in ways I should have stopped long ago." His confession wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about himself, about years of cowardice disguised as patience. Naomi placed her hand gently on the counter, not too close, but steady. "Grief changes people," she said softly. "It doesn't excuse cruelty, but it explains it. What she's done to me I can endure, but what she's done to herself, that's the real tragedy." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, someone had spoken the truth aloud. Evelyn's cruelty was not strength, but grief rotting inside her. And in that moment, Jonathan saw Naomi not as a housekeeper, not even as an employee, but as someone who understood wounds the world pretends not to see. What neither of them realized was that Evelyn had been standing at the top of the stairs, listening. And for the first time in years, tears slipped down her face. From the night she overheard Jonathan and Naomi in the kitchen, Evelyn Whitmore was not the same. At first, she avoided Naomi more than ever, embarrassed that her private grief had been exposed. But something had cracked inside her armor. The cruelty no longer came as sharply. The mocking remarks slowed. And slowly, almost reluctantly, Evelyn began to watch Naomi. Not as a target of disdain, but as a mirror of strength she had long abandoned. One morning, Naomi entered the dining room to find Evelyn sitting alone at the long mahogany table. Instead of barking in order, Evelyn quietly gestured toward the empty chair across from her. The invitation was awkward, heavy with pride still lingering, but Naomi accepted. Over tea, Evelyn asked about Naomi's family, the first personal question she had ever posed. Naomi spoke softly about her son, about loss, and about survival. Evelyn listened, her eyes brimming though she tried to hide it. That conversation was brief, but it was the first thread in a fragile new fabric. Change did not come overnight. Evelyn stumbled often, her old sharpness returning like muscle memory. Yet Naomi never met it with spite. She answered with steadiness, reminding Evelyn not through sermons, but through presence that cruelty was a choice, not a destiny. Jonathan, watching quietly, saw the weight lifting from his wife, piece by piece. He saw how Naomi's quiet dignity was doing what years of wealth, travel, and therapy had failed to do. It was healing the household. The shift became undeniable the day Evelyn herself unlocked the nursery. She stood in the doorway trembling, the room exactly as it had been, toys frozen mid-play, a crib still neatly made. Jonathan moved to stand beside her, but Evelyn shook her head. Then, turning to Naomi, she whispered, "Will you help me clean this room?" It was the first time Evelyn had ever asked Naomi for help without condescension. Naomi entered, and together, the two women folded clothes, dusted shelves, and placed away memories with care. By the time the room was done, Evelyn's face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were lighter. For the first time in years, she had released some of her pain. Months passed, and Naomi's role in the Whitmore household grew larger than her job description. She became a quiet force of balance, a presence that kept both Evelyn and Jonathan grounded. When Jonathan later drafted his will, he included a clause leaving Naomi a portion of his estate, not as charity but as recognition. "You've given us more than service," he told her. "You've given us back our humanity." Evelyn did not protest. In fact, she insisted Naomi accept it. Her pride had once recoiled at the thought of granting respect to a housekeeper, but now she understood the truth. Naomi had been the strongest among them all along. In the end, the Whitmore mansion was no longer a place defined by bitterness. Its walls no longer echoed with cruelty, but with something closer to peace. Naomi had come as a servant, endured as a target, and departed as the quiet healer of a broken family. The lesson remained etched in the house long after. Dignity cannot be stripped by insult, nor diminished by cruelty. It endures, and sometimes it transforms even those who once tried to destroy it.